In round 7 in Bilbao, the games between Anish Giri and Sergei Karyakin and Hikaru Nakamura and Wesley So weren't terribly interesting. Neither game really looked like it was ever going to be any other result but a draw. But the game between the world champion Magnus Carlsen and the Chinese prodigy Wei Yi was much more interesting. We joined the game after 19 moves. Carlsen with white, and this is a very pleasant position for white. Carlsen has the 2 bishops, he has space, and black is really, well, you can see behind the first 3 ranks, black is a little bit passive. This position arose out of a fianchetto variation against a Grunfeld, and I think Carlsen would have been very pleased with this. In fact, this exact position has occurred in one game previously. In fact, this whole line is pretty well known, and it's well known to be pleasant for white. Well, in this previous game between Matveeva and Huang, Matveeva played knight e4, and this gave white some advantage. Let me just show you a couple of moves from this game. And here, well, the game went on a long time, but it's clear that white has the advantage, because here black has a couple of problems. Black needs to keep the challenge on the c file, otherwise white could enter on c7, but also black needs to take care of the e7 pawn, and because of that, black is really torn here, and sometimes there's the possibility to advance with d6 to open up the diagonal for the bishop. So knight e4 I think is a decent move here, but Carlsen chose knight a4, which keeps more complexity in the position. It's a very interesting move. Sometimes it might be possible to play bishop g4, knock this knight out, and then come in on one of these squares on c5 or b6. So that's one idea. And well, the other thing is that in this position, actually queen a5 is threatened, which just gives and it enables black to exchange pieces. So it's a good idea to move this knight. And what Carlsen is doing is trying to tempt b5, because if this comes, then white will at some point or other be able to use the c6 square for the rook. That's a beautiful jumping off point. Wei Yi exchanged rooks and then played bishop d4, but well, yeah, this after queen d2 the bishop just came straight back again. I mean, you can see that black is very solid, has few weaknesses in the position, but is really rather passive. I suppose the one very nice thing about black's position is the knight on d6, which can't be driven away by a pawn, but it is permanently under fire from that bishop, so black has to take great care. And here Carlsen played h4, which I thought was very strong, just to try and advance that h pawn and maybe even put it on h6 to set up back rank tricks. But with hindsight, this turns out to be not such a good move. Instead, probably just bishop g2 would have been more prudent, and the point of bishop g2 is just to keep the bishop out of range of these knights. As we'll see, they become quite frisky. After h4, this was simply blocked by h5. Very good move. So that means there's no nonsense with white advancing with the h-pawn, and sometimes one of these knights can actually occupy g4. And that's why it would have been more prudent to play bishop g2 and for the time being keep the pawn on h3. Later on this might happen, but first of all bishop g2 is more prudent. Anyway, h4, h5, and here again bishop g2, just ducking out of the way before any further action probably would have been a better idea, but instead Carlsen played knight b2, just redeploying the knight. So, well, if black isn't careful, for example, okay, knight f6, it's a bit of a nothing move, then knight c4, and it's clear that white has a really nice initiative here. Sometimes, well, there's a threat to exchange and then take on d6, and sometimes that knight can move into e5. Nice position for white. But Wei Yi seized his chance. Knight b5. This was very alert. So this knight is coming in here. And of course, white doesn't have too much time to react because there's the threat of bishop c3 winning the exchange. Now, you could say the normal move here would be to play rook c1 to cover c3 and to occupy the c file. But watch what happens. Knight d4. This is suddenly very dangerous. Knight e5, threatening a knight fork. If that, well, white is still okay after queen d1, but then the knight can occupy g4. But if white continues playing normally, let's see what happens. Knight g4, and then even e5. Now I'm playing a series of terrible moves for white, but this is just to illustrate what can happen if white isn't careful. Queen's attacked, and then knight e2 check wins material. Now that was not ideal play from white, but an illustration of black's activity. So rook e3 to cover c3. But anyway, knight d4, and this move e5. I'm sure Carlsen couldn't imagine that this move was possible, because after exchanging, then this unleashes this beautiful light squared bishop. But just for the moment, white's pieces are very awkwardly placed. You can see this bishop is under fire, can't retreat. You can see the rook gets in its way. First I thought rook d3 was a very strong move, and Carlsen thought for some time in this position, but rejected rook d3. In fact, black can crawl out of this one. Knight f4 is the best move. And after rook takes, knight e2 check, and queen f6. And black has enough activity in this position. The white knight and pawn are attacked. I mean, white can save this with knight d3 or knight d1, but certainly, you know, something like this followed by rook e2. I can understand why Carlsen thought this was too risky. Black is taking over the initiative, and black's king completely safe, but white's king looks a little bit vulnerable here. So instead, Carlsen played a much safer move. He played knight c4. After knight takes, he didn't need to damage his structure. He could exchange and then play queen f4. And white is a tiny bit better because his pieces, you can see quite plainly, are just a little bit more active, and those pawns are potentially vulnerable. But Wei Yi again defended extremely well. First of all, b5. The knight really has to come back to stop a nasty check on e1. And now here, I think if Wei Yi had just put his knight on e5, I don't see that Carlsen has really anything at all in this position. Black is just fine there. Instead, he kind of rushed it. He played queen e5. I have a feeling he thought he was liquidating to a draw straight away. But in fact, after queen takes and bishop takes, I suspect Wei Yi missed Carlsen's next move, which was b4. And surprisingly, this gives white just a little something in the position. It fixes these pawns on light squares, and it means in this position, after bishop b7, black has to play passively, because if bishop takes pawn, then bishop takes a6 and white wins a pawn. So in this position, after bishop b7, knight b8 is forced, and that's a little bit uncomfortable to consign the knight to such a passive position. Knight d5 covers this pawn. Now, in fact, you know, there's not so much going on in this position. It still should be fine for black, but Carlsen finds ways just to keep the pressure up. It's very interesting. So what he's doing with f3 is he wants to play g4, and let's say king d7, g4, and black has an uncomfortable decision. Does he allow an isolated pawn on h5, or does he exchange on g4 and allow white an outside pass pawn? So tricky stuff. So Wei Yi thought, right, I'm squashing that idea. but in playing f5, of course, that leaves g6 vulnerable. And in this position, knight f4, a very difficult move to meet because, well, you can see the g-pawn is attacked. And particularly short of time, this is not an easy decision to make. Wei Yi decided to go for it and exchanged off that knight. Of course, there were options to take on b4, but then knight g6 would have given white some real advantage. But this is a really tricky endgame because you can see all of white's pawns are on light squares. And good morning, we have a nice bishop ready to scoop as many pawns as possible. So after this, well, black is going to have to defend passively. After knight c6, bishop f7 is not good enough. In this exchange, the king comes across and can stop this pawn, and black is fine. So first of all, after knight c6, white has to defend that pawn with a3. And now bishop f7 to attack the pawn, and knight e7 covers the pawn on g6. And now this position is so close to zugzwang. If that pawn had stood on g3, then black would be utterly lost in this position. The king could advance, the knight can't move, the king would have to retreat, and then white's king could enter into the position. But with the pawns doubled and this weakness on f4, black has just enough to hold the game. Let me give an example. If king e3, wanting to go to d4, then knight d5 check. Now the king pawn endgame is a clear draw, and if king d4, you take the pawn and defend the g pawn. That's the point. And this is Carlsen's problem. He finds it's almost impossible to approach, or it is impossible to approach successfully in the middle of the board. Black is so passive, but still impossible to crack. Well, he tried, of course, and many players have cracked under such pressure. So Wei Yi decided to wait. So this king skirts around, avoiding any tricky knight d5 moves. And now king d3. Now the problem is, after king d4, in fact, the king can just be checked away and the knight goes back, so nothing gained. So king c2, the king wanders over to play a4, so hoping to create another weakness perhaps here. But nothing doing so far. If bishop g6, then this is still okay for black, and black is going to take here. So king c3, knight e7, so black waits again. In fact, in this position, I think black could probably just wait passively, but instead Wei Yi decides to cut and run. And this is a good policy. Let's just finish the game here. Of course, to play a move, a committal move like this, you have to calculate a great deal. Well, first of all, the king and pawn endgame is going to be a draw. So what happens on takes? This is the game continuation. And now the black knight heads back to take on f4. And he doesn't bother playing b4, he just decides to head for straight for a draw. Very sensible policy, a very long game. And now white just doesn't have enough, as we'll see. Basically, all black needs to do is give up the knight for the f-pawn, and here they agree to draw. Of course, this is a theoretical draw, because if king takes, then the black king comes back into the square, into the corner, and it's the wrong coloured bishop. You simply can't drive the king away, and it's a very well-known draw. Fascinating struggle. Carlsen turned things on, but Wei Yi didn't crack. Very, very impressive. Carlsen only just won their first game in the tournament, but today Wei Yi hung on. I think Carlsen will be kicking himself though, because out of the opening his position was promising. It's a Carlsen type position. Very nice, steady advantage. And I think that h4 move was just a little bit careless. If he played bishop g2, I'd have put my money on Carlsen to win. But that's all said with the great benefit of hindsight. Anyway, Carlsen still leads the tournament with 3 rounds to go.